All right, in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the risks of DIY divorce. Now, I'm fairly transparent and I tell people that you can do a divorce on your own. That doesn't mean you should. Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And it's really important. If you have children, you have property, if you might be entitled to maintenance or spousal support, or there's debts that were acquired, don't do this without talking to an attorney, because there are some things that you can do that, quite frankly, can't be undone. If you're doing something that you've never done before, you're not going to have that experience. You're not going to have that ability to learn from your mistakes, from the things you've done in the past to make it right. Sometimes when you sign these deals, they can't be undone. You might think you got a fair deal or a great deal in the process, but if you didn't know what your obligations were or your rights were, then how do you know if it's a good deal? You see, I sometimes have people come to me and think that, well, I wasn't going to get any maintenance anyway. And I say, well, why do you say that? Well, because I had an affair. Well, that doesn't matter. They say, well, I, didn't want this anyway. I just wanted to get it over with. Well, these are things that have consequences. See, there are causes and effects. Decisions have consequences. If you come to me years later after doing something on your own and ask me to fix it, I can't undo everything that's already been done. I can't give you a second bite at the apple because you already had a judge sign your documents. So be very careful before you do that. There are some things that are just procedurally done wrong, such as filing the wrong papers and things like that. And you sometimes can get a second bite at the apple on some of those issues. But I see people that try to use fill in the blank forms for things that have no business having fill in the blank forms in there. For example, if there's property, transferring a property needs to be done the right way. If you're going to divide retirement accounts, you need to have the right language in your documents. If you don't, when you go and try and enforce that later, you're going to run into all types of problems, and you're going to have to try and redo things that should have just been done the right way the first time. Before you go down this route and think you're saving yourself a lot of money and heartache, you just may be deferring the payments that you should be making now. And quite frankly, when people do this, it ends up costing them more in the long run because we're having to undo certain things. Now we're having to try and go over it. And if they would have just done it right the first time, it probably would have saved them a ton of time and a ton of expense in the future. So I want to tell you a little story about a client of mine that had a DIY divorce that kind of went wrong. And the reason it went wrong was because there was things that he wasn't thinking about that I easily would have seen. Now, what happened was they were working fine together. They were actually kind of on the same page. And they said, we don't need a lawyer. Let's just go ahead and do this ourselves. It makes sense until it doesn't. And so what they did is they said, okay, you can stay in the house until our youngest graduates high school. Then we'll sell the house and we'll split the proceeds 50-50. Sounds good. Sounds reasonable. But the problem was the markets changed significantly. And here's the thing. The law says anything acquired during the marriage belongs to the marriage. Anything before the marriage or anything after the marriage belongs to that person. But what about this house? You see, this deal was put into place where he stayed in the house. He made all the payments for all these years. Property taxes, mortgage payments, everything like that. So the value of the house was not placed into the judgment. So it wasn't clear. Did they intend to split the house then, or did they intend to split the house at the time of the sale? And then what happens is the market changed significantly. Now they're trying to figure out, well, how much do I owe? And what price should I pay? And if I was there at that time, I would have simply said this: listen, this is not a deal that you can't do. We just need to think a little bit further ahead, because are you agreeing to a price now? Or is everyone on the same page that we're going to allow the market to decide what we pay? Now, I would advise against that because, unfortunately, if you think back to 2007, 2008, people used to rush through these terms of a judgment. They'd say, oh, we'll just list the house for sale, then we'll split the proceeds. Well, if you may recall, in 2009, there was a housing bubble pop. And what happened was these people that thought they had equity in the house all of a sudden had a liability. And these judgments were written in a way where they just punted it down the road. And it was lazy drafting and people trying to cut a corner, where if you do this the right way, you can make sure you cover these things. You can say the parties agree to split any proceeds. But then you could also say they'll also split any liabilities, or you could reserve the liabilities, but be on the same page. Make sure that you talk about these things, because things do go wrong. Things do change. And if you have proper guidance, people that can ask you the right questions, you can start thinking about things that, quite frankly, you probably wouldn't have thought about. That, quite frankly, these fill in the blank forms don't have you think about. You see, a lot of times people say, my debts are my debts, or, their debts are their debts. Well, the reality is any debt acquired during the marriage belongs to the marriage. So sometimes people will agree to pay something 50-50, or will split up all the debts. Well, that's great. But then practicality comes into play. How are those actually getting paid? Which one of the 6 debts are you paying? Which ones of the 6 debts is your spouse paying? If you don't have that clear, then what happens is somebody misses a payment. Somebody else then decides not to pay the other one, and now you guys are fighting over things that didn't need to be done this way. Simply take the time to have somebody in your corner that can say, who is paying for what? And then what happens? And then what happens? We can guide you through these things so you can avoid some of these costly mistakes in the future. Let's suppose that you and your spouse are on the same page. In fact, you've got a crafted settlement agreement, and let's go a step further. Let's say that your spouse went to a lawyer because you saw one of my other videos where you said, hey, the fill in the blank forms are not always appropriate. So you said, all right, let's have one attorney draft this and put it together. Now, this is a common mistake that I see people make. Just because someone's friendly doesn't mean they're looking out for your best interests. In fact, in Illinois, a lawyer can only represent one person. I've had people come to me before and say, can you represent both of us? And I clearly and flatly say, no, I cannot. Because in a divorce situation, you cannot represent the best interests of both people. I can do it for my client, and I can go through all the questions that I would go through with them, make sure they understand the document, and then I can present it to the other side. And if they have questions, I can say, I cannot provide you with those answers. Go speak with a lawyer. Now, in a situation like this, it's absolutely appropriate. Go find a lawyer. Pay them for their time. Ask them to review the document. Ask them to explain it to you in English so you understand exactly what you're going through. Now, is this the best case scenario? It's not the best, but it's better than nothing. Having an attorney go through this stuff and explain it to you in plain English, and making sure that they're asking you questions so they understand your situation better before you sign that document is so much better than just assuming that your spouse's lawyer is putting together a fair deal for both of you. Before you sign a legally binding document, make sure you understand what you're doing, because some things cannot be undone. If you waive spousal support, or you waive property rights, or give up certain things, these things can now be considered irreversible against you in most circumstances. So before you sign anything, please talk to a lawyer. If you'd like some help with something like that in a limited scope fashion, reach out to my office. We'd be happy to go over your options.